Hey there, welcome to Coffee Break Plans. This week's topic is my December reading journal. Plus, I'm going to finish off my book bracket for 2025 and I'm going to go through my book matrix, which is a reasonably complicated process that I will step you through. So, I'm going to start off with my December reading journal. I read a huge amount of books in the end, and I didn't even list them all in my TBR. What I used to do with my TBR is I'd write my initial list, then I would read my way through it, and if I ended up reading more books that were on the list, I would then add them to the list. But I've decided I don't need to do that because I keep a record of every single book I've read on the main master list, which is a bit further back. I'll get to that in a minute. So I didn't need to write it twice by adding it in here. Now, because I read so many books in December, I realized that one page just wasn't going to cut it, or it could, but then I wouldn't end up being able to write much. So I've put in this little tip in to give myself some extra space. So my book of the month was actually 4 books, or I guess you could call them 3 and a bit books. And it's what I tend to call the Jack Parlabane trilogy by Chris Brookmyre, even though it's not a trilogy and there have been several Jack Parlabane before these ones. But this is where Chris Brookmyre took a bit of a turn from his more comedic style of writing and went into the full-on mystery genre. And they are outstanding books. I tend to read them every few years or so. So each book in this series is a separate mystery and a separate story. However, there is one overarching story arc that runs all the way through, and that is that Jack Parlabane has got himself into some serious trouble because of his journalistic practices, and he ends up on the run from the police. But in the meantime, he's also solving mysteries. So in the last day of Christmas, it's the initial scandal that crops up where he gets himself into trouble. We then get into Dead Girl Walking, which is a rock band that's touring Europe and things that happen on that tour. The next one is Black Widow, and there's a woman who is accused of killing her husband. And of course, Jack Parlabane gets involved in that. And in the final one, all of the things that kind of started off in the last day of Christmas all sort of come home to roost in Want You Gone. You could probably read any of these books on their own. As I say, they are standalone stories. These books weren't even on my original to be read list, and I ended up reading them, and they have taken away the title of the book of the month for December. I'm just going to consider this to be one big long book. You've got your prologue and then your 3 acts. Over the page now. So these 2 series I partially read as part of the October reading challenge. So I read 1 book out of each series. So I decided this month to go back and finish them off. So this one here is the Harper Connolly series. It's about a girl who's struck by lightning, and after that she can sense where dead bodies are, and she uses that gift to help people find missing persons, provided they've died, of course. And the Day Shift and Night Shift are books 2 and 3 of the Midnight Crossroad series, probably my favourite Charlaine Harris cozy mystery series. And it's just a bunch of people who live around a crossroads, sort of in the middle of nowhere in Texas. And without saying too much, so there's a vampire, there's a psychic, and there's a witch to begin with. And it just follows their lives over the course of 3 books. And again, can't say too much because I don't want to spoil it. But I read these every couple of years. And the final book that I'm going to put on this page is called Forsaken Skies, and it's book 1 of the Silence series. These books came in a mystery sci-fi box, and quite a lot of the books in that box were not that great. So I wasn't expecting anything fantastic out of this, but I was pleasantly surprised. It's set in space. Humanity has spread out from the Earth and is investigating other worlds. And one of these other worlds encounters an attacking force which is threatening to pretty much wipe out everybody on the planet. And a little ragtag group of ex-military people decide to travel to the planet to help fight off this force. So it's overwhelming odds. There's a real mix of different personalities and situations. You don't have just gung-ho characters just rocking out there with guns blazing. There are some really nuanced characters and interactions between them. As I say, I was very pleasantly surprised with this book, and I'm looking forward to reading the final 2 books in this series. Finally, in December, I signed up to Kindle Unlimited for a trial, and went through and chose a whole pile of books to add to my list. And 3 of them I finished off in December. So one of them was The Rose Code, and this is about the female code crackers that worked in Bletchley Park. It's told along 2 timelines. There's them in the present, and then there's them looking back in the past, and it just goes into the relationships between 3 women in particular, but the various relationships that they were having with the men in their lives and their commitment to the work and to the code cracking. Really enjoyable, and was definitely in the running as the book of the month. However, I found it dragged a little bit towards the end. By the time I got to it, I was ready for the story to wrap up, probably about 3 chapters before it did. But I found that I thought that about quite a few books this month, so I have a suspicion it was a me thing. I think I'm at the point where I'm kind of done with reading a lot of World War II books, and I do recall saying that earlier in the year, but everyone in my book club was going on about this book, so I thought I'd better read it. And yes, it was good, but it's not something that I would have chosen off the shelf for myself, but still an excellent book. So if that's your thing, highly recommend. I also read Sally Hepworth, The Mother-in-Law. Sally Hepworth is very good at writing dysfunctional families, and this is a classic example of her writing. It's about a woman who tries to please her mother-in-law and just never seems to get there. Very cliche, I know, but excellent story. I highly recommend that as a great read. I also read Margaret Atwood, My Evil Mother, which is a Kindle original series. And of course, these are short stories designed to be read in a single sitting. And it's just basically about a mother and daughter relationship, about how she's been brought up by her mother, who is a witch. Towards the end, it has a little bit of a twist. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to ruin it for anyone who is going to read it. You can read it in one session, which I did, and I did enjoy it. And then finally, I read 3 books. I was part of a book club subscription that was sending me a contemporary popular book each month. And so I was receiving them, and I was never really getting around to reading them. So I finally just sat down and said, right, that's it. I need to read them this month. One was Maggie, or A Man and a Woman Walk into a Bar. That was really enjoyable. That wasn't too long. So Buckeye, again, I felt like it was just going on just that little bit too long, and I felt like it could have wrapped up a few chapters before it did. But again, I think that was a me thing. I don't think there was anything wrong with the book. But the big surprise one out of these books, it was Heart the Lover, which was a medium-sized book. Wasn't too long, wasn't too short. It starts off with like a university love triangle, then ends up going in a whole different direction. And I really enjoyed the switch and the change and the character development and what happened. So that was kind of the surprise pick out of those. However, I have cancelled that subscription to that book club simply because they're about $40 a book. And if I'm going to be paying $40 per book, I want it to be something that I'm actually choosing for myself rather than having someone else choose for me. Because my taste is so varied, what other people may choose for my gender and age group may not actually be anything that I'm interested in at all. So I end up with a lot of books that I wouldn't have chosen for myself, but I make myself read them because I've just paid $40 for it. And I've decided I don't really want to do that anymore. So I've cancelled my subscription. My apologies, I forgot to press record when I was writing these out, but I don't think you're missing much. So that concludes my December reading journal, my book of the month, and the rest of the books that I read. So now I'm going to go and finish my book bracket off for 2025 and then do my book matrix, which I'll talk you through. This is the double spread that I set up each year. And basically what it does is it uses 2 different methods to pick what my top read of the year is. So this is the spread that I set up each year. Basically, it uses 2 different methods to figure out what the best book of the year was. So this is the book bracket on the side here. And how it works is each month you pick the best book that you read in that month. Then you take each pair of months and you pick the best book out of those 2. And you do that for the entire year, and then you end up with your 3 finalists here, and then you pick the best book out of those 3, which goes here, and I've chosen The Survivors by Jane Harper. And then in the second half of the year you do the same thing again, and you end up with your 3 finalists, and then one of those books will end up here, and then finally you pick the best out of these 2 books, and that is your overall best book of the year. Basically just a knockout round, like in sports. If you make it through this round, you go to the next round. If you make it through this round, you go to the next round, and then you just have your 2 finalists and you pick the best out of those. So pretty simple. So I know what my best book of December is, so now I need to pick my best pick out of November, December. I need to pick the best pick out of the 3 best books for the second half of the year. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in my December pick, my November, December pick, and so on, and then I'm going to pick my finalist. So this completes my book bracket for the year. As you can see, the Jack Parlabane trilogy won out of November, December, but Apollo 8, which was my best read for October, was the best book that I read in the second half of the year, and it in fact was better than The Survivors. So that was my best overall read this year. So moving beyond the book bracket here and onto the book matrix. And how you do the book matrix is you choose your top, whatever number you pick. I usually choose 10. So your top 10 books that you've read during the year, and you compare each book to every other book on the list, and you decide which one is the best out of the two. And then you do that for every single match, and then you count up how many times each book won the match between two, and then whichever one has the highest count is the top book of the year. And what this does that the book bracket doesn't do is it takes all books read during the year, not just the ones that ended up being the best out of that particular month. So what you end up with is books that appear in the book matrix but don't appear in the book bracket. Sometimes you have a month where you read several books that aren't that great. So for example, in August, the top book was How to Survive a Horror Story, which as I recall was mediocre at best, but it was the best book out of the rest of them that I read that month. But in October, I read several excellent books, and Apollo 8 just happened to be the best one of that. But I also read Something Wicked This Way Comes and Faithful Place. They make it onto the book matrix to be assessed, and yet How to Survive a Horror Story doesn't, because I didn't consider that good enough to make my final top 10 list. Because I wasn't quite sure how this worked, I've actually already filled it out. I did it on a separate piece of paper, and instead of replicating it onto this page here, I'm just going to cut it out and glue it in. But I'm going to cut it out and glue it in a way that I can fit the full title of the book in along the page here. So I'm going to erase this and then cut and glue this on, and then I'll step you through the process of comparison and what I did here. So that's my book list, A to J, and I have already gone through and compared. So I'm going to compare Everyone on This Train as a Suspect with The Survivors. And in this case, The Survivors was better than Everyone on This Train as a Suspect. So in this box, I'm going to put a B. So then you go down to the next book. You're still comparing Everyone on This Train as a Suspect to What Time the Sexton's Blade Doth Rust. And in this case, I decided that book A, Everyone on This Train, was better than C. And then you continue to do that for every single pairing, and then you write down the letter of the winner in each pair in the box. So I'm going to go through and fill this out as I've already penciled it all in. So then to tally them up, you count up how many times A appears. So if you count here 1, 2, and that's 2. And you do the same thing for B. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for B. And you do that for all of them. And you can take up these tallies and you can figure out what your final ranked list is. So the winner with 9 votes is Apollo 8. So that's my number 1 read. And then of course that matches with my book bracket. But you'd expect my number 2 book to be The Survivors, and I suspect it's not. No, my number 2 book is the Jack Parlabane trilogy. I know it's not called that, but I know what it is. And then you continue down the numbers until you get your full rank. So number 3 is Faithful Place. So you can see here Apollo 8 is the winner, the standout winner of the bracket and the matrix. But where you would expect The Survivors to be number 2, it is in fact number 5, because some of my best reads didn't necessarily take out the best read of the month. So when you get so I've made it down to 4, which is He Would Never. And what I've ended up with is 3 books that are all sitting on 2. So in order to get the ranking of that, I did a little mini book matrix off to the side where I just compared those 3 books with one another to see what ranking they were going to be in. So as it turned out, number 7 was Everyone on This Train. Now, you may have noticed that sometimes one of the big winners during the year, so Coastliners and The Eyes of the Dragon are the 2 that I have in mind, they didn't even make it through to the book matrix. I decided to exclude them out of the running because they are books that I've read several times before. I have read Apollo 8 before, I have read the Jack Parlabane trilogy before, but not as often as I've read these 2. So I felt that these were outliers. So I decided to not put them into the book matrix. It's not a precise science. It's not a science at all. This is just about what I think my top readers. So there we go. There's my top 10 list for 2025, and that completes my book matrix. So I'm going to do a very, very quick flip through of my 2025 reading pages. I started off with my goals. I have 2 annual goals, and that was to read a total of between 60 to 100 books and to read all the Trixie Beldens, which I did do and thoroughly enjoyed. And I had a rough idea of some monthly themes, and I sort of started listing them out. And I put together a little tracker of what themes I picked, and they ended up being not even really anything to do with these. I just picked what it was I felt like I needed to do this month or what I felt like reading that month, and I just picked a theme that fitted. So those were my themes for the year. My book bracket, all done in the washi tapes of the corresponding months. Number 1 book is Apollo 8. And my book matrix confirms the same book as number 1, but slightly different orders for the rest of them, right down to number 10. All excellent reads. I have my total books read list, which I do every single year, on these waterfall tabs here. So I'll just page through these. And I ended up reading so many that I finished this off, and I put in a little tip in just to cover those last few books. 112 books this year. I think that's the most I've read in a year since I was about, 16. Hang on, we'll just do some running repairs here. This was my October challenge. It was the Bewitched book challenge that was run by Erin Smith. Her and her book club came up with a whole bunch of spells, and each spell had 3 prompts, and you picked a book that fit the prompt. And if you read all the books for each spell, you cast that spell. And I managed to read a book for every single prompt. So I cast all of the spells, bagged myself 81 points. So I was an archmage, but I was doing it on the twin sigil level of difficulty, which meant each book could count for 2 spells. So you'll see there is some replication in here where the same books are in 2 different spells. So that was all part of the rules. That was okay. And now we're into our monthly reads, and with my TBR on one side and my reviews on the other. So I'm just going to quickly move through these. One of my favourite reading months this year was August, because I just decided to pick 2 of my favourite authors and just read a whole pile of books by them, and then a whole pile of other books that I actually wanted to read, rather than reading it because I felt like I had to. So this was a glorious month of reading. September I found really hard because I was just trying to clean out this list. October, I showed you the previous layout of the October book challenge, and I just picked 4 top books to feature in here. And then November, and then of course we just did December with its little tip in. And we're now moving on into 2026, and I've already finished a book. So the very last thing to do is to set up my January TBR. And as you can see, I've already penciled these in. I don't really have any annual goals this year. And so instead of pretending like I'm going to have a monthly theme, I'm just going to do what I've always done, which is to just pick some rough themes that fit what I want to read that month and follow those. So these are the books I've chosen to read this month. I'm just going to pin those in. So that's January all set up, ready to go. Now I can put my ribbons back in an appropriate place. And we're done. That's it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed that, and I will see you next week. Until then, take care.